Welcome back. We are on the last video number 4 of chapter 6. As always, starting us off with my horrible joke. Do you guys know why crabs don't donate to charity? It's because they're shellfish. So a little bit of a joke and a pun. As always, take it in. But now let's get back to U.S. history. So section 4 is going to be mostly about something known as populism. Now, populism is going to be, in a way, a political party that is going to start to form at this time period. And they are going to be formed mostly of farmers. Now, farmers at this time really have a rough life. You know, we talked about the Homestead Act and how they tried to get people to move to the Midwest before, but the people who already had established farms, life was going to be very difficult for them. You know, there's always a push for new technology. At this time, we have new farming technology, which is going to be a good. It's going to be a benefit because you're going to be able to produce more. But once more people are producing, jobs are going to be lost. So that's going to be one area that's going to be difficult for them. The Interstate Commerce Act, they're going to be able to regulate tariffs. They're going to have to ship all their goods, and they're going to have zero control over how much it's going to cost to ship. So, you know, farmers really are struggling at this time period, and populism, or the populist political party, is really going to start to be that kind of push for legislation, for law, to kind of help them out. Another area where it's going to be difficult for them was going to be money, which money is always going to kind of be the root of most of the stuff that we talk about, whether it's law or why war is going to be fought. You know, talking about the idea of taxation and the Revolutionary War. But taking a step back, during the Civil War, the federal government tried to expand their supply of money. Now, this kind of sounds like a good idea at first because they want to have more money in circulation. They're going to issue millions of dollars of something known as a greenback, which is going to be paper money, because the government needs this money to buy more things during the war. However, as I'm sure you guys talked about in world history, when we have more money that's going to be in circulation, it creates inflation. And that means that the dollar is going to buy less. So there's going to be too much money. So something that used to be like $1 per se is now going to cost $5 or $10, depending on how much inflation there's going to be. So farmers, no matter what, when the inflation took place, if they owed money on a loan, they still are going to have to pay that back. So they're kind of struggling with the idea of inflation. And then after the war, the government, they stopped printing greenbacks. They also made it so you cannot trade in greenbacks for gold or silver coins. Now this causes deflation, where the prices are going to start to fall. Now, whatever something that used to be $1 is going to kind of have that opposite effect. So prices start to fall, and there's going to be less money in circulation. And as I said, the farmers, they're going to be hit the hardest by this. So really, you know, talking about this idea of inflation, deflation, tariffs, farmers, they're struggling to make ends meet. So to kind of help out with that, they're going to start an organization known as the Grange. So in 1866, the Department of Agriculture sends Oliver Kelly to tour the rural South. And he's sent to the rural South because there is this quote-unquote claim that they had no idea what life was like in the South for farmers at this time period. So Oliver Kelly, he's supposed to go out and speak to all the different farmers and get their own perspective, get their kind of view about what life is like for them. However, that's going to be very difficult, because the farmers are so widespread, they end up starting the organization, which is first going to be known as the Patrons of Husbandry, but then changes names to the Grange, which is going to be what is known as, for the remainder of the time it's going to be in operation. Now, the Grange, it kind of starts out more of like an educational and like a social gathering, but then they realize that they have people together. They kind of, in a way, have their own political party. So they now start to push legislation. So the first thing they're going to start to push for, they want to have regulated railroad and warehouse rates. Again, this was basically decided on how good of a negotiator you were. But no matter what, when you had a finished product, it had to be shipped. It had to be sent out by the railroad. And the railroad companies realized they had a monopoly. Therefore, when you have monopoly, prices up, up, and up. They keep getting higher and higher. So they're going to fight to regulate those railroad, and they're also going to do the same thing with those warehouse rates. They also want to create a cooperative to regulate farm prices. Now, one of the most difficult things about regulating the farm prices is you knew that there was always somebody who was going to sell their product cheaper. And there's so many farmers selling wheat, for example, that if you were going to sell it for $10 a bushel, someone's going to say, hey, Don't sell it to them for $10. I'll sell it for $9. Now you realize that person's selling it for $9. It's going to go for $8. And as you can see, it's just going to get lower and lower and lower. Now you have a cooperative. Farmers sell that to the cooperative, and then they sell it out to different companies. So instead of having everyone negotiate your own price, you sell it to the cooperative, and they regulate farm prices that way. So the grain, it starts in 1866. It goes until about 1890. At that time, it changes to the Farmers Alliance. And again, they want to kind of do the same thing. They want to try to create cooperatives. Now, they try to create like large-scale cooperatives, which the Farmers Alliance kind of fail in that regard. But really, it's just kind of a push to help out with farmers. And they create the Populist Party in Kansas. They're known as the People's Party. But eventually, they do try to get involved with the election of 1896. Now, Republicans, they are going to support William McKinley. Democrats and Populists, and I say Populists on there because they're hoping to nominate Grover Cleveland, but they couldn't get the remaining Democrats on board. But the Democrats and Populists eventually they nominate William Jennings Bryan. Now they do their campaign completely different, which is why this it's so interesting to me. William Jennings Bryan, he does what he calls now William Jennings Bryan, he travels by rail. So basically, he is just going to be on the train. He's going to go from city to city, and he is going to give a speech at every town he comes to. It's kind of like if you ever imagine like one of those old-time rail cars. He takes a step out, and it's almost like there's a fence, like a little platform. He's going to stand there. He's going to give his speech over, says goodbye, gets back in the train, goes to the next town. Now, he gives over 600 speeches in 14 days. Can you imagine how exhausting, how grueling that would be to give that many speeches in that amount of time? Now, McKinley, he does the complete opposite. And when I explain this, a lot of people just say that's kind of like a lazy way to campaign, but his was more successful. He's going to end up winning. McKinley launches the Front Porch Campaign. So he wakes up in the morning, has his morning coffee or whatever, goes outside, and there's just tons of reporters there. The reporters ask him question after question. It's almost kind of like having like a mini debate. He's just answering all these questions, maybe for an hour, 2 hours. Any more questions? Nope. Okay, we're done for today. Goes back inside. Now, who do you think was able to reach more people? The person going by rail, city to city, or the one using the newspaper? It was William McKinley. He was able to basically just stay at home, work for like an hour a day, and he wins the election, known as the Front Porch Campaign. So this is going to kind of be maybe not necessarily like the final end of the Populist Party, but they are going to lose, and William McKinley is going to win the presidency. And then the last one, relatively short because we're going to talk about it a lot throughout the rest of the semester, but Section 5 and the rise of segregation. Now this is, we've talked about segregation before, but now it's going to be very much the governments of the states are going to support it, and eventually the national government is going to support it as well. And it starts because a group of people known as the Exodusters head to Kansas. Now this is going to be kind of the first migration of African Americans after the Civil War, heading to Kansas, heading to this kind of newer territory because they want to make a living. They don't just want to keep working on the same place or the same plantation. So Exodusters head to Kansas, and once there's this migration, it's going to be widespread. More and more people, more and more African Americans are going to be moving all throughout the United States. So many of the states' governments, they are going to impose their own segregation. Now, the first thing that they're going to do, they're going to impose a poll tax. Now, we'll talk about this more in POD next year, but voter turnout is relatively low. People don't want to wait in line to vote. Like me, for example, when I voted last time in Mercer County, I waited in line like 2 hours to vote. Now, not many people would be willing to do that. Now, could you imagine waiting 2 hours in line and then having to pay once you got there? Well, that's going to start to turn more people away. But they didn't really do that to turn away people who were white. They did this mostly for African Americans because they knew African Americans could not pay a poll tax to vote. Now, these election officials, oftentimes, when people were white went to vote, they just kind of, oh, yep, you can go through, it's fine, turn the other cheek, as I just did in the video. But when African Americans came through, they definitely had to pay a poll tax. which was, I mean, it was relatively low. It was about $2, but still the point was people who are poor are not going to vote, especially when they have to go and pay for groceries or a place to live. Voting is not going to be the number one priority. So they're able to do this. They also enforced literacy tests. Now, literacy tests, this was dependent on the person giving you the test. Some found it easy, some found it difficult because it could be literally one question or it could be 100 questions. And as we're talking about with segregation, people who are white, they would get 1 or 2 questions. People who are African Americans, they would get question after question after question until they got one wrong, and then they're not able to vote. So poll tax and literacy tests are also going to be ways to reduce the amount of people voting. They also institute something known as a grandfather clause. Now, what this is going to refer to, there were still a lot of people who were white that could not pay or pass literacy tests. So because of that, the grandfather clause stated that if you had a relative that could vote in 1867, so if you had an ancestor who could vote in the year 1867, you were grandfathered into being able to vote. Now, people who were not able to vote in 1867, mostly African Americans. So because that people who are white, they were still going to be able to vote. And then lastly, we have Jim Crow laws, which are going to be state-sponsored laws that are going to impose segregation in many public buildings. Now, the response by African Americans, there was kind of two very different reasons. Now, Booker T. Washington, he wanted to more compromise and educate. He thought that that would be the better way. You know, it's not going to happen right away. We need to have compromise, and eventually, as we start to get more and more compromises, the African Americans are going to start to get more rights, and they do that through education. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois, he needs activism and change now, which is not necessarily going to be more radical, but it's not going to be through laws and waiting for compromises. But the rise of segregation is going to kind of start again around this time period after the Civil War, and really it's going to take a long time for it to stop.